Welcome back to another episode of Establish the Edge. I'm your host, Mike Leone. Really excited for today's episode as we're bringing back the offseason's projections special podcast with Ben Gretch. We did this series last year. I highly recommend you go back and listen to the intro of the first episode we did last season. It's in the Establish the Edge podcast feed on iTunes. You can check that out. Even if you're watching this on the YouTube channel, you can find it there. It's not going to be on YouTube. It's going to be on the podcast feed, but we'll do a brief intro today, kind of explaining our process. But essentially, we're going to have 8 podcasts over the next several weeks, one for each division. And within those podcasts, we'll get kind of nitty gritty into the projections, details, some things that stood out to us, some things that, might be irrelevant or very relevant. And you just go through that and apply kind of the pros of projections to rankings and drafting and the cons of projections to rankings and drafting. And no one better to do that with me than Ben Gretch, who I highly recommend subscribing to his Substack. It's bengretch.substack.com. He's doing a lot of offseason content now. Just had a really good post on AJ Brown and targets per route run. And targets per route run, something we'll hit on today in season for his stealing signals. It's the absolute best week to week to keep you up to speed on player level usage and team play calling and whatnot. You can also hear him on the RotoViz podcast with Sean Siegel called Stealing Bananas. You can find that on iTunes. So Ben, thanks so much for joining me. Pumped to have you back this year.
Yeah, man, I'm really excited. It's funny you said no one better to do this with. That's not true at all. But for me, there's no one better to do this with. You are the projections goat. I'm super excited to come on and basically put my projections up against yours and see where I'm wrong.
Don't be so modest. Although I did see this AJ Brown projection. It's pretty high. It's pretty high. So we'll get into that on the NFC East.
What did you expect?
Episode. But yeah, overall projections, the way I really like projections because I think it gives me a base to be grounded to when doing the rankings. But there's obviously limitations to that. And Ben sometimes will, refer to projections can be overly precise because it's one number. So at ETR, what's driving our rankings are these base projections we're going to talk through, along with we mix that with some ceiling outcomes with players to kind of get a better mix for more actionable rankings. So the base projections aren't 100% the base rankings. We want to institute some more of the range of outcome thought process. But doing the projections, Ben, can kind of like help you see the range of outcomes, even though you do have to pin it down to one number.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge thing. I talked about this recently on the pod that you mentioned that I do with Sean Siegel, Stealing Bananas. And also shout out to Ship Chasing on Wednesday nights, which, those are our boys, Pat Crane, Pete Overzet. That's another place you can find me. We got to always make sure to plug them. But Sean and I were talking a little bit about the projections process, and he asked me a really good question about how to sort of thumb the scale for these upside scenarios that you think exist on players. And it got me thinking in a way that I think is the best way to describe some of what I see as the challenges with projections. When I go through it, I want to use a guy like Ja'Marr Chase from last year, right? He's a rookie coming in. I know you thought he had a huge ceiling. You were really high on him. I was as well. We took him together in our NFC draft that was very successful. That's a guy that, as a rookie, it's impossible in a projection to project out what you think his true ceiling is with his elite prospect profile and all of these things that he could do for the offense. To do that, you would have to you'd have to bring, Burrow's numbers way up, the pass rate way up. You'd have to probably impact in the projection T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd and other players quite a bit. Joe Mixon, maybe. I mean, you have to do something that is out of line with the market for this team, and essentially wouldn't make sense for the Bengals from like a market perspective. But the Bengals wound up crushing their market expectations, right? Like they were expected to finish last in their division. And a lot of that was this Chase explosion and the impact it had on the offense. So the way that I put it when I was talking with Sean, when he asked me that, was like, I feel like you can thumb the scale like 5%, 10% one way. But if you get too far making Ja'Marr Chase's, blow up outcome the base projection, it changes too much else because everything has to add up and everything has to come together in the projection. So even though we thought that Ja'Marr Chase had this outcome where he could beat our projection by 50%, right? Like some huge blow up, you can't really project that. You can only thumb it, 5%, 10%. So going through the process to be like, I do think there's a scenario where this player can beat his projection by 50% is just as useful as, the ultimate outcome you get with that one projection.
Yeah, I think that is really well said, and it helps a lot on guys whose ADPs start to skyrocket it up. We're going to talk about Gabriel Davis in this episode, but you learn your stopping point, I guess. Like, okay, this is just getting too far away from like a base expectation. Like, even though we see this huge outcome, you kind of learn your stopping point. On the flip side, sometimes there's some, I get made fun of for liking the dusty olds, but sometimes there will be a guy where I'm like, okay, I've docked this player as much as I could in every single possible spot, and they're still okay at this point. And that's where the projections can help you. Where if I was just going off feel, you would never draft them. From like more of nitty gritty, actually doing the projections, there's a lot of quantitative info. Obviously, for play calling, Ben, we're using pass rate over expectation. We're looking at pace, plays that the teams are running. We're looking at projected game script a little bit on an individual basis. The efficiency stats for players, where we think those are going to go, kind of their historical production, factoring in some regression. I know, Ben, you like to look at targets per route run a lot, and we'll go through on individuals how we kind of work that into determining the target share tree for different teams. And it's targets per route run, routes run. That combination is essentially what's going to give you the target share, although it can be somewhat nuanced. So all that plays in, but we also want to bake in the qualitative info. And this year, you're going to hear me hit on situations that have a lot of unknowns. And I think capitalizing on uncertainty is huge. It's kind of funny because we're doing a projections podcast, but it's actually the projections that we're least certain about that can be the most profitable ones. Jamar Chase last year, very uncertain projection because he's a rookie and there's literally zero NFL production to go off of. This year, we have a lot of coaching changes, a lot of QB changes. So there's a few of those spots that are going to be really, really interesting. We get a coaching change in the AFC East with the new coach for the Miami Dolphins, Mike McDonald. So that'll be fun to talk through. I think we can get into it, though. I don't want to spend too much time on the intro. We did a really extensive job on that last year. So again, find that first episode from last season if you want to hear more about.
And we'll hit on some of the stuff as we talk about the teams, right? Like
more of the intro absolutely.
Will come as we go.
So I've got up on the screen, if you're watching on the YouTube channel, the odds for the AFC East. We'll start with the favorites, the Buffalo Bills at -225. And from a team level expectation, we're pretty similar. Ben and I each have Buffalo with a 63% called pass rate, and that is called pass play. So scrambles are considered a called pass play in that number. Where we differ a little bit is in the total plays run per game. Ben, you've got one more play per game than me, a slightly higher pass rate. And essentially that comes out to roughly one more pass attempt per game for Buffalo, which is, might sound small, but it can be, a decent size thing. And we're really close on a lot of the team level stuff. The Buffalo pace is interesting to me. Last year, I believe they ran over 67 plays per game, which was really high. One of the things I started doing this year was, especially for teams in more stable situations, you never get a fully stable one, but limited coaching turnover, limited player personnel turnover. I've been looking at and actually baking into our projections 2 years out, as well as like last year's statistics. It's given me a little bit more of a signal boost. They were closer to league average 2 years ago. And I started looking at some play clock stuff for pace using the NFL Fast Hour data. So the amount of seconds that are left on the play clock when the ball is snapped in neutral situations, and Buffalo is kind of met on that. So I have them regressed a little bit more than you. Again, we're being kind of nitpicky, but I like to, especially in the first one off the bat, when we have a little difference here, kind of talk through that.
And this is a great team to start for the team level. The team level stuff is so important in a projection. I didn't know where to go with these guys because we know they throw with intent. They play fast. They're going to be in some shootouts. I basically wanted them to be around the high end of my range. There's not a ton of teams that I'm this far away from what I'm projecting to be the league average. I'm about 3 plays over where I'd have them around the league average. You're about 2 plays over it. but I love those notes because I'm maybe a little bit high.
Yeah, I think it's close. And I will say sometimes, just admittedly from a bias standpoint, and I do have to shout out at this point too, our projections at DTR, we got a whole team working on them. Silva and Levitan, it's awesome to get their thoughts, but do have to specifically shout out Jack Miller and Mark Dankenbring, who have helped me a lot this season. It's made it a lot easier having those guys help and second, third set of eyes on those things. But sometimes, Ben, it's hard to not let the ranks that spit out at the end bias a little bit. And I may have shaved off a little bit of plays from Buffalo just because we're so high on Buffalo everywhere, which is surprising because they're a popular public team, but have found that we're above market on basically the majority of Buffalo Bills, particularly in like home league ADP, which is early to look at that, but even in underdog ADP, with the exception of maybe this big move from Gabriel Davis the last few weeks. But Josh Allen looks to me like the clear QB1. I hate drafting a QB early, so I probably won't have too much Allen, but I have taken him in underdog drafts at the end of the third round just because, like, Ben, it's hard to pick any holes. If he stays healthy, it's hard to see a season where he's not, a top 3 fantasy quarterback, which seems crazy to say with all the talent out there at QB now.
Yeah, I mean, it's he's the easy QB1, I think, just because the rushing value is so high and the pass offense is now so established as a pass heavy and pass offense. I mean, he's just like the perfect fantasy quarterback. He's, Cam Newton is a rusher with a high pass rate and great receivers and everything you'd want. So it's a fairly easy one. There's not much that we need to spend a lot of time on with him. His projection comes out very good.
Yeah. The only sliver of concern with the Buffalo offense is they do lose their offensive coordinator, Brian Daboll, who goes to coach the New York Giants, which we'll cover in the NFC East podcast. Ken Dorsey, who's the quarterback's coach, takes over. And there was some rumors last year that McDermott and Daboll butted heads, and McDermott maybe wanted to run the ball a little bit more. I don't know if there's any validity to that. I hope there's not, as a fan, as a fantasy player and everything. And it really hasn't impacted my drafting at all, but it's at least worth mentioning. But we'll get to the running back situation. And we both have James Cook right around 120 half PPR fantasy points and 140 full PPR fantasy points. We're pretty in line on James Cook. Ben, you're a little bit higher on Devin Singletary. You've got him with 185 full PPR points. I've got him with 158. And it seems like just a mixture of overall workload. You've got a bit more to Singletary. I still have like a little bit of work for Zach Moss and Duke Johnson, like whoever that third back ends up being for Buffalo. So that'll be something to keep an eye on. Even with that said, I think Singletary has become somewhat undervalued. And you probably definitely agree with your projection. It's a situation for me where, like, people aren't overreacting to stretches of production from last season like we've seen in the past. And if anything, sometimes they're underreacting. And I thought Singletary would be really overvalued, but with the Bills drafting Cook, it's like people forgot that we have seen an upside scenario where he's getting 80%, 90% of the team snaps. And just knowing that he has that in his back pocket on a team like Buffalo makes him a really good pick. And, once you hit the double digit rounds or even round 9.
Yeah. And there's a couple interesting things here. I mean, I think right away, you mentioned this to me before the show, it looks like as we're kind of comparing our projections, I'm maybe a little too concentrated on some of these offenses. I might come in a little hotter than you on some of these players. So us being closer on Cook and me being higher on Singletary is probably more notable that the gap between the two. Like in my projections, I actually have Singletary with a few more targets and you have quite a few more for Cook.
Mm-hmm.
And that's maybe wrong on my part, but I am kind of feeling like, I think Cook's definitely going to play a good amount. I have them very close in targets, probably play on some passing downs and things, but Singletary being the established player for a couple of years versus a rookie, just feel like they're going to lean on him a little bit more than maybe the market feels right now. And I do think it should be a bigger gap than there is in drafts. And then the element of the third running back or fourth running back, I thought it was interesting last year. Like Breida was good at times, but they really kind of took a while to like go to him until they were like almost completely done with Zach Moss.
Yeah.
They kind of like this 2 running back system.
Yeah, they were primarily 2 running backs, and they were just getting no production. And eventually, they tried to work on Breda, and then it seemed like they were going to go to Moss, and then Singletary just eventually wrangled the job, and down the stretch, it was all Singletary. So, yeah, it is interesting. I do think like there's low key some personnel usage uncertainty with Buffalo between like how do they utilize Cook? You know, how much rush work is he going to get? How much work is he going to get as a pure passer? You know, is he going to play some slot snaps? And they also brought in OJ Howard as a tight end too that they really haven't had. Like, are they going to run some 2 tight end sets this year? So there's some wrinkles. My biggest question though with Cook for you would be, what kind of upside does he have? Because I can see end of the season it being obvious in retrospect both ways. That one, like, oh, this is a dude that catches 3 to 4 balls a game and gets like 6 carries, and there's just like literally no way he can pay off in a big way in fantasy. Or he's catching 5 balls a game and rushing 10 times, hyper efficient and awesome offense, and he just makes it look easy. Where do you lean there?
I hear you. I don't have like a strong lean. I mean, something that plays in for me certainly is the addition of Crowder, and then Isaiah McKenzie and how that's going to play out. But the fact that they sort of have 2, I mean, they sort of did last year with Beasley and McKenzie, but they sort of have 2 established short area options. McKenzie had the really strong game when he got the start late in the season last year. What was it, like 11 targets, 10 catches or whatever. So there's some debate about who will get the primary slot work. And main reason I bring that up is they haven't always thrown to the backs a ton, right? And so
yes,
I don't feel like they're losing enough with Cole Beasley going away that trend is going to change a ton. So in terms of Cook's like overall upside, it's hard for me to see him catching 5 a game. It's hard for me to see him. I've heard like the Alvin Kamara comps from Kamara's rookie season, but Kamara was going into an offense that over multiple years was established at throwing to the running backs a ton. I mean, they were the top team in the league, the Saints. And he, wound up being the next great receiver and better than many of the guys before him. But for Drew Brees, who was basically the best quarterback for running back receiving in the NFL for our fantasy purposes, Josh Allen is somewhere on the other end of that scale where he's not great for it. It's a really good offense. There's a lot of touchdowns available, and there's certainly upside for Cook, and I'm not like out on him at all because he's very affordable in drafts. But that's a really good way of putting it. Like, what is this pure upside? I don't think it's rookie season Kamara. I don't think he has that in his range. And I do think that Singletary, as we were talking about with the target splits, is still going to catch enough passes. I mean, he's been a pretty decent receiver, not great, but serviceable, and I think he's still going to be as a veteran, still going to kind of have at least
they did though. I did actually, as we're doing this podcast, I did shift some running back 3-4 work to Singletary on the rush share. I think we might have shorted him, but on the receiving point, we'll point out like Buffalo really made a point to get a pass catching back this year. They tried to sign JD McKissick. They thought they had the deal done. Then they draft James Cook. So I do think it could be kind of good night for Singletary in the pass game, like from day one, unless Cook is just
that's a good point.
Like bad.
Yeah, that's a good one. The McKissick point is a strong one for sure.
Going to wide receiver, you're a little more concentrated on the top end. No surprise, you're going to see our biases come out here. No surprise here that Ben has less targets for Jamison Crowder than me, and I have more targets for Jamison Crowder. That comes a little bit at the expense of Diggs and Gabriel Davis. I will know, we're ahead of ADP on Stephon Diggs, and Ben's even more bullish. So that's a good sign for Stephon Diggs. I had tweeted about Stephon Diggs this past offseason, just kind of looking like what went wrong for Diggs. And honestly, at the end of the day, his catch rate falls from 77% to 63%. That's it. His yards per reception is the same. He was finding the end zone. People are talking about, how they spread it out more and the targets fell off. Like the targets fell off a little bit. He had 2 less targets in the previous season in 1 more game. It wasn't a crazy shift in target. So a guy that when we did this series last year, we're like, this could be the wide receiver one overall. didn't happen. He also had the way his stats were distributed over the course of the season, I think left a bad taste in people's mouths where it was like kind of this boring outcome after boring outcome and that's just kind of random, but like the numbers were there over the overall year. I almost feel like if he had some worse games and some really better games, people would almost think of the season a little bit more fondly than it turned out. But and
the expectations were so high, and we always respond to expectations. I mean, we were taking him in the first round. I was definitely taking him, and then he's more of like a second round producer or maybe third round. I don't know. I don't know the exact amount, but he was still very good. He's still a top 10 receiver. The way I'm thinking of it is 2020 still happened also. So like, you definitely have the recency bias that 2021 was poor. I think we saw the ceiling. I think we saw the floor in this outcome. You talked about how it was mostly just efficiency, a few more incompletions on targeted passes. I'm looking at both those seasons, kind of combining them and saying, I still think he has a ton of upside. I think he can still bounce back and have another 2020 type year, but this is like his range the last 2 years in a very pass heavy offense where he's still clearly the number one.
Yeah. So I'm pretty into Diggs at the 1-2 turn. I do think he's a first round talent. We have him as wide receiver 5. That's probably where I'm going to keep him, ahead of CeeDee Lamb, behind Devontae Adams. And we'll talk about some of those names when we get to the other divisions. Gabriel Davis is the most interesting guy to talk about on this offense, though, easily. If you're playing on underdog, he's gotten steamed to the point where his ADP is in the low 40s, which is really rich. If you're playing in more casual leagues, he's like a free pick in the 6th round, where at that point, like it's pure upside. Is he worth it in the 4th round? I'm not so sure. I think the ceiling here is massive, Ben. I think the ceiling's massive, and I think the floor is better than people realize. So like I'm mostly pro Gabriel Davis. The 40s it starts to get rich. But essentially, whenever Manny Sanders or Cole Beasley were out last year, like his usage was fine. And if you look at the usage down the stretch when those guys were all healthy in the playoffs, Gabriel Davis was playing 100% of the team's offensive snaps round 1, while the game was close versus New England. That game, they blew him out. And then obviously he had one of the best playoff games in NFL history against Kansas City. And I'm mostly bullish on Gabriel Davis. It's hard to know where to stop chasing the price tag, but I think the ceiling's like absolutely huge. And they brought in Crowder, which is kind of like a Cole Beasley replacement. They did not bring in a Manny Sanders outside replacement.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, and there was some talk that maybe they would take a receiver in the 1st round of the draft. Maybe they would sign various guys. Christian Kirk was an option, which wouldn't have really been a Davis replacement, but there was some talk in free agency. They didn't do any of that. You talked about how down the stretch Davis was playing more. One of the like big picture long-term trends we know of is that day 3 receivers like Davis tend to break out a little bit later. I've seen a lot of people say, well, he already had a really good rookie year. Why didn't they go to him last year? I mean, I don't really have an answer for that. But it is interesting when you look at the long-term trends, and we know that the guys that get draft capital tend to get thrust into routes early at the wide receiver position. And then, I mean, there's a guy we're going to talk about on the show, Jacoby Myers, another, no draft capital, barely plays his rookie year, is good, essentially didn't get to play the first maybe like 6 or 7 weeks of his second year, and then earns his way back onto the field. And from then on, had like an 11-game stretch that was an incredible season in his second year. And then finally in his 3rd year, he was thought of as a full-time receiver from week 1 on. But he had to sort of re-earn his spot in the offense his 2nd season. Sometimes we see that with these, later receivers, that they flash for 1 year and the team isn't really ready to commit yet. Davis... So basically, I'm saying I'm not holding it against Davis that he wasn't starting from day 1 last year and he got beat out by Emmanuel Sanders and those types of concerns. But yeah, the clear thing for him is just like he didn't run a full set of routes last year. His targets per out run took a huge jump. He has a high ADOT, so he's getting valuable targets down the field. He has a strong end zone target rate, red zone target rate. They run a lot of these like deep posts from maybe 25 yards out. So maybe it's not great to look at the red zone route or target rate compared to like end zone shots, but they definitely love to go to him. Like the high TD rate can carry over. I feel like I mean, we saw it in the playoffs, but the 4 TD game isn't the only thing in his profile. His profile already looked really promising at the end of last year before his playoff stretch. And so now it's just a question of, will he get to be a full-time receiver, full routes all season? I think it's really possible. That's ultimately like what the drafters that are taking him this high are saying, is that they're making that bet. He's going to be a full-time receiver in this offense, downfield role, red zone role or end zone role, touchdown equity. I mean, that's a very valuable receiver in a really pass-heavy and high-scoring offense.
Yeah, and I honestly, I think it's more probable than not that he's in that role. Like, who are they going to throw out there if it's not Gabriel Davis right now?
Right.
Like, Jamison Crowder is not playing on the outside. He's not playing that role. Shakir, who they drafted, is a slot guy long-term for the team. They've got McKenzie, who's slot guy, gadget player type. There's no one for this to compete with Gabriel Davis for this role. So it's just a matter of, he's going to be on the field, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Like, I have no issues. Like, the people who are look at last year are like, oh, is he going to be? He's going to be on the field. Whether he's able to produce at the level we saw last year, being on the field all the time, all year long, that's more of the question mark.
To that point, I wasn't very high on Emmanuel Sanders last year, even as a late round guy who could have some production. He played a lot more than I thought he would, because the Bills are basically like, this is the guy. Yes, they had Gabriel Davis as well, but they're essentially like, this is the guy we have slotted in for this spot, and they kept running him out there, even as he wasn't particularly good. He had some flashes for sure, but I think we can kind of take their movement at face value and say that they intend to run him out there, like you said. Like, they intend to use him in this role, in the Emmanuel Sanders role, or a hybrid of the Emmanuel Sanders role and his own part-time role, essentially as a full-time secondary outside receiver. So yeah, I mean, I feel like my projection on him, which comes in a little bit higher than yours, is actually a little bit restrained, frankly, from where I feel like I could have gone to. I mean, there's another element here where, like, his targets per run weren't fantastic, but he's also like the third or fourth option in a lot of the passing plays when he's a rotational player. At times last year, we actually saw in the playoff game, look, when he's a starting receiver, he's going to be the first read more often. He's going to be the guy they're going to think about going to. And they started to do that down the stretch in that game. Obviously, that's not the only data point, but I mean, the Chiefs couldn't stop it, right? They're like, as teams start to pay attention to Stephon Diggs, they're going to draw up plays for this other guy who's on the field. So if they make that commitment to him as their number 2, he gets more first reads. I think that helps his targets per out run. I think he can continue to grow.
Yeah. And talking through it, I also feel like our projection might be a little bit restrained. And sometimes it's hard not to be a little restrained when you haven't seen it before and you're making a leap. But I think all the evidence points towards, wheels up for Gabriel Davis. I do think Crowder still holds some value, just because, like, Cole Beasley was seeing targets, consistently, like high teens target share. And we only have Jamison Crowder for like a 15%, 14 to 15% ish target share, gets him at 89 targets on the year. I think he's still going to take some targets from the top guys, just because with the high pass rate over expectation, you do kind of see that slot guy target. It helps them move the chains in that spread type of offense. So a little bit higher on Crowder than you. And we're about equal on McKenzie, who I do think is worth a stab at the end of drafts, just because the type of offense that it is. And we did see him flash, even if it was only for a game. We saw some ceiling from him.
What do you think the odds are that McKenzie is either rotating in, or if he's just in his same role from last year, basically? Like, is he playing more of the Cole Beasley? Is Crowder just taking that as McKenzie still McKenzie? Like, what do you think the odds are that this is a little bit more of like a rotational situation in the slot?
I feel pretty good that Crowder is taking Cole Beasley's role and McKenzie's kind of just doing what he did last year. They might be quicker to make a switch if Crowder's not producing than maybe they were last year, which really, it took Cole Beasley to be hurt and not play for McKenzie to play that role. The deal McKenzie got was really low, much lower than I expected. I think it was 2 years, $4 million, which is basically nothing.
And he plays special teams, which frankly can bump that up a little bit.
So I love the idea of Isaiah McKenzie, but I think Crowder's kind of locked in as their slot guy for most of the season. I think you would have to get hurt or perform really poorly for McKenzie to make a meaningful dent into that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The tight end stuff, Knox is always difficult to project. We just took the under on his receiving yards for the season as an official prop bet. I think it was like 625 yards or something. Ben and I both are projecting under. Ben's got him at 585 yards from 76 targets. We have him at 533 yards off 71 targets. Both have him around 5.5 touchdowns. Very similar lines overall. Seems to be going a little rich for me in drafts just because I don't know if there's a situation where the target share really increases for Dawson Knox. I kind of think last year might have been the peak for him. The flip side to that argument is that last year was, a breakout year, and he's just, a very good player, and, it'll change moving forward. His catch rate hovers around 55% each of his first 2 seasons, goes up to 69% last season. Like, that's a huge, huge uptick, scores 9 touchdowns. But ultimately, I'm a little bit bearish relative to the market on Dawson Knox. They did also bring in OJ Howard, who I wouldn't say he takes stuff from Knox, but it's like someone in the room who has talent, and there was nobody that had any talent in the tight end room outside of Dawson Knox previously.
Yep. I mean, that's basically exactly how I put it. I think Knox is a little high. He definitely has explosive week potential. We've seen the multi-touchdown games. I get that in best ball, some best ball exposure. I personally won't be touching him in redraft at his cost. I think he's being overdrafted right now.
Let's go to Miami. Miami is a fun team to look at. They are second in odds in the AFC East at plus 450. I always like to look at the teams with coaching changes, and they bring in Mike McDaniel. I always say Mike McDonald by mistake because there's a Canisius College where I want a basketball coach named Mike McDonald. Mike McDaniel comes over. If you haven't seen his press conferences, dude's legit hilarious. So there's part of me that's rooting for him. I wish he wasn't in the AFC East. But what's interesting, Ben, comes from an offense in San Francisco that was really efficient, but they weren't, they weren't very pass heavy at all. I mean, that's an understatement. They were very run heavy. They got a ton of yak yardage, and it's always hard to tell, when you're coaching under a guy like Shanahan, like how much is it Shanahan? How much of it is just the personnel? They had uniquely strong players in Deebo Samuel and George Kittle. But we ultimately have arrived on some pretty similar numbers, around 64 plays per game with about a 61% pass rate. When we start looking at like sacks and all that stuff, I do end up with about close to a play more per game than you, and that is found in pass attempts. We have the exact same amount of rush attempts per game at 26.6. I don't feel super strongly on any of that other than,
this is a really tough team. I mean, they're McDaniel comes from a historically run-heavy team in San Francisco. This is a roster aligned to pass. I put the pace around league average, a little bit better than league average. I had the pass rate basically right around where my league average is going to be. I don't know. I don't know.
Tua is interesting. We have very similar passing lines on Tua, like really similar, 28 touchdowns, about 4,375 yards. You have him rushing a little bit more than we do. That's something I'll have to go back and double check, but ultimately very similar lines. He is one. I really struggle not getting a top 10 to 12 quarterback in redraft manage this year. It just seems like those guys have a ceiling that once you get past that, there's only a couple guys that can really touch it. Tua is a tweener guy for me, where I think he's got an interesting ceiling as a late round QB candidate, but it's capped to an extent, right? Like he's never going to be a top 6 guy, top 8 guy. I think he can be a top 12 guy. Is that how you feel about Tua?
Yep. Yeah, I think that's well said.
Running back, tons of uncertainty because it's like an entirely new running back room. Myles Gaskin is here, but he's, we've got him in the RB4 spot. They bring in Chase Edmonds on a really legit deal. Raheem Mostert comes over not on a super legit deal, but does have some familiarity, of course, from being with McDaniel in San Francisco. They also did sign Sony Michel. You are pretty high on Chase Edmonds in the receiving game. You have him about 13 more targets than us. We have similar amount of rush attempts, about 130 rush attempts, giving very similar rushing lines. I'm torn on the target stuff with Chase Edmonds. It didn't seem like San Francisco targeted the running back a lot, but maybe I should be thinking of this through more of a player heavy lens. And obviously Chase Edmonds has the pass catching chops. That was his exact role with Arizona, a double-digit target share guy. So it's possible we're light. I will say, if we're light, like Chase Edmonds is a really good value because we're actually ahead of ADP on Chase Edmonds with a somewhat conservative target share. And he's someone I'm really coming around to lately as a running back that I like to target. In his FFPC ADPs in the mid to late 90s. He's RB34 on FFPC. We have him RB30, 90th overall.
And he's been a good receiver the last few years. I mean, I think about the only thing splitting up the rushing work felt like a total guess, but about the only thing that I felt confident about was that he's probably going to play on all the key passing downs. Why else did they pay him the contract they did? I mean, that's what he's been very good at.
Yeah, so I think it's possible we're light on the receiving stuff. I do think that Raheem Mostert is going to be the RB2 here. I feel like he's got a leg up on Sony Michel, but when I say feel, I mean feel. Like that's a feel thing. It's guesswork. I'm not entirely sure. Sony makes the team. Of course, Mostert coming off injury has his own question marks, but he's someone I've been taking late round just because, the historical rushing efficiency is there. And I could see a situation where, we see a backfield rotation here. And again, I have that projected, and Chase Edmonds still spits out well. So that's not a knock against Chase Edmonds. I think he's a very strong play. Do like Mostert as a late round running back target. Silva and I did a draft last night. It's on the Establish the Run YouTube channel. You can check that out, an NFFC draft. And we did end up taking Mostert, I think, around 16 or 17, very late. That's a kicker defense. So like one of the final two rounds.
Yeah, I mean, I like Mostert. I'm projecting Michel to get more carries, so it's interesting. We're kind of a little bit split on who the RB2 will be, but I see it exactly the way you do, where like it's going to be a little bit of a rotational thing. I think probably some of my restraint is just concern about Mostert's ability to stay healthy, which is always one of those things that you have to figure out how to factor into a projection. It would not surprise me if this goes either way in terms of which of these backs gets, starts to approach 150 carries and which of these backs is well below 100 carries. It'll kind of just be, I think, determined on health. I mean, it would be interesting if Michel got cut. I guess I hadn't really considered that possibility. But if they're both on the roster, it's going to be like, who's healthy, who's getting, who's the lead back for a given week.
They're not going to be startable if they're both on the roster out of the gate. For sure.
Yeah.
Wide receiver stuff. So we're pretty close on Jaylen Waddle. Again, we kind of take a conservative approach with a lot of the target share stuff. So we have kind of more targets to the 5th, 6th, even 7th guys in the pecking order at times. So we're a little bit lighter on the top end targets, but we're pretty close on Waddle. We have 125 for Waddle, and you have 127. Where we start to differ is you have 149 targets for Tyreek Hill. We only have 130. And that's a really interesting one to talk through. This is one of our bigger discrepancies because that nets out to a change in about 80 fantasy points in half PPR, which is really meaningful. You're kind of talking about whether or not Tyreek Hill is a good pick in the second round, or basically.
This is an error.
This is an error. Okay.
This is an error because I haven't done my KC projection yet, and we're pulling in my Tyreek Hill projection from
this makes sense. I bet we're going to be closer.
Yeah, let me fix this.
I bet we're going to be closer.
I apologize.
That's all good. This is why we do this. Spreadsheet errors happen.
Spreadsheet errors happen. I just deleted
this. Oh my God! Now we're like identical. 130 targets to 130 targets. So it's problem solved. Now it's boring. Now
it's boring. That's my bad.
The exciting twist to this, though, Ben, is because I was surprised when I saw that at first because I thought we were in agreement on what I'm about to say. And it turns out we may still be, which is like low key would not be shocked at all if Jaylen Waddle outscores Tyreek Hill. That's one of my hot takes. The rest of the projections team isn't with me, but the young ascending player who just came off a really fantastic rookie season, and this stuff that he did well, the short ADOT area of the field, is going to be enhanced by a coach where like Waddle just went from a terrible yak year to having the coach that breeds the yak gods in San Francisco. So I'm really excited for Waddle. Tyreek Hill starting to age a little bit. New team transition, goes from one of the best quarterbacks in NFL history. We can already say that Mahomes is that talented, to a more questionable quarterback, particularly with downfield throwing. So I'm more in, especially at cost, I'm more into Waddle than Tyreek.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I think there's more uncertainty with Tyreek as well, right? Because we know that Waddle played pretty darn well with Tua last year. Looking at Waddle just on his own merits, he looked like a great second-year wide receiver target, which is a classic player we want to target. He dominated target share last year as a rookie. Didn't really have the explosive plays, something that should be a part of his profile. Didn't really have the downfield stuff. Maybe Tyreek's presence allows him to see more downfield stuff, or just gives him more room to run after the catch on some shorter stuff. I mean, a lot of times in fantasy, when we get too many mouths to feed, it feels like there's not a lot of great ways that this can play out. But NFL seasons are always very chaotic. I mean, one of these guys could get hurt, in which case either guy is going to be in a good spot. But Waddle is the one, especially at a cheaper price, that already looked like a pretty clear target. I mean, Tyreek Hill's incredibly good, but I'm the same way. I mean, I have him very close to. It's funny because I was looking at this at first. I was like, I didn't think I projected them that far apart. And I went back to my other projections. That's where I noticed. I'm with you. I have them a 0.5 percentage point apart in market share. I think Waddle could out target Tyreek. And
I honestly, I think Waddle does out target Tyreek. Like I think I'd take even money on that. Our projections don't have that because, again, team projections, and they're more accurate because they're team projections, and you don't necessarily get all my hot takes. But my hot take is I would take even money that Jaylen Waddle out targets Tyreek Hill this year.
I think that's fair. I think both of them are going to get some of the Debo role in this offense. I have both of them projected for a decent amount of rushing. I have Tyreek projected for a little more. I think they're both going to get some jet motion, maybe tip passes, things like that. It's going to be really interesting to see how Mike McDaniel uses both of these guys, because he can do a lot of really fun stuff, and I think he's a really creative guy. And you talked about, you listen to him in pressers, and you're like, this is a dude that's going to have some playground plays with Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle drawn up. He's going to do some fun things. I'm excited to see what he pulls out, but I think they're both going to be moved around a lot and kind of treated like two number ones. I don't think there's going to be any like clear, Tyreek Hill is better than Jaylen Waddle or anything like that. So it should be really fun.
And as you said, Tyreek comes with uncertainty. I think uncertainty in general is a really good thing to target, but it depends on the baseline. And when the baseline is coming from Mahomes and being one of the best wide receivers in the entire NFL, the uncertainty is more bad than good, in my opinion, relative to that baseline. Of course, the cost has been adjusted a little bit in drafts, but that's why I think, Tyreek's case is different than some of the other cases we'll talk about, where I'm really trying to target the uncertainty. I do have Cedric Wilson with a little bit more play as a third wide receiver, just kind of seeing like the bullshit Jawan Jennings targets and stuff we saw last year in San Francisco. I don't know how much that's Shanny or coming over from, if it's McDaniel, if that'll come over at all. But I do have some more peripheral targets, but that, we're really in line with Waddle and Tyreek. I've mostly taken that at the expense of Mike Gesicki. This is a team that also used a lot of tight ends last year. So maybe I've made the mistake of sort of double counting against Gesicki, where I've given Cedric Wilson more targets as a third, as the slot guy there, but I haven't maybe given enough. I haven't taken away targets from the 2-3 tight end sets that we saw last year with a different coach. So that'll be interesting to watch. I might shift some more work to Gesicki.
That's tough. I have Gesicki pretty high. It's a different coach. I think it's interesting that Tua last year for a large stretch was basically just targeting Waddle and Gesicki. Like that was it.
Yeah.
And he has that rapport. So certainly the new coach is going to change things. But McDaniel does obviously come from a team that uses the tight ends a decent amount too. Did a lot with Kittle and some creative stuff, some block and release stuff that maybe won't go to Gesicki. So it's kind of because he splits out so much, it might go to Durham Smythe or somebody like that. So it's kind of tough for sure. But I'm sort
of burying the lead though, because Gesicki's going off as tight end 13. We have him with that somewhat conservative target projection as tight end 10 on FFPC, tight end 12 on Underdog. So it's kind of like,
and there's probably upside.
How far ahead of like how far ahead of ADP should you be? Ben's got a little bit more bullish case, but we're kind of both saying this is a draft target right now.
Yeah, I think it can be very concentrated between Hill, Waddle, Gesicki with said Wilson maybe playing in like you were talking about, but could be pretty concentrated.
Okay, New England is plus 500, very similar odds to Miami. We came up with very similar play calling. They're a fun team to talk through the play calling. I think the first thing you have to look at last season, if you look at New England for the year, of course, I'm looking at something that's not sorted by team name and couldn't find them right away. They had a 55.8% pass rate. But Ben, you just take out the crazy wind game against Buffalo, and they jump up like 3 percentage points, just taking that out. And for context, they threw the ball 3 times in an NFL game.
Which was the fewest since the merger. I mean, even fewer than any game in like the 70s when they were, every team was throwing less. It's absurd. You have to have them running more plays than last year and throwing a bit more, I think, than the last couple of years, which we agree on, which is good to see for me.
Yeah, 58% pass rate. I could see it even a little higher. Combination of one, if you just throw out that game, we're already pretty close to last year's number. 2, Mac Jones's second year. Do they put more on his plate? 3, I feel like this team, this is more of a gut thing, but I think they ran pretty well game script wise last year. And yeah, they're third in the division odds this year. They were in the division lead. They were the favorites to win the division with a month left in the season. So that very well, more than likely, will not be the case this year. So you could see more pass volume. Mac Jones, not a lot to talk about. I really haven't been drafting him with Ben's projection. I'm assuming he's not too much of a target. Of course, he'd be a best ball or super flex only candidate anyways, where you need to be drafting multiple quarterbacks. But even with the team throwing more, I don't think there's a ton of upside there. Throwing more is all relative. So I think we can go to running backs. I was very surprised at how close we are on the running backs. It's somewhat creepy given that there's a lot of different backs that you can give volume to. But Damian Harris, we each have around 180 rush attempts, 20 targets. Ramondre Stevenson, around 150 rush attempts, a little bit higher on targets there with 36. You have 25. That's coming from James White, who I'm a little bit lower on targets wise. Just unsure if he's going to be pop or not with the hip injury. And then there's Pierre Strong, the rookie. The guy I'm mostly fading here is Damian Harris, where we took the under on 10.5 rushing touchdowns for him as a season-long prop. He ran really pure on TD rate. Those are the type of bets you want to make. Not that it can't happen again. They do use him in a really good spot where he should have a higher TD rate than the average back. But I think that comes down, Ben, which makes Ramondre, I think, pretty interesting.
And so it's interesting because we have very similar projections, but we maybe have slightly different takeaways because...
Okay. So you're on Damian Harris?
I'm not on Damian Harris. I'm also not on Ramondre because when I did this projection, I realized that Patriots not only brought back James White, who might not be healthy, they signed Ty Montgomery. This is a ridiculous thing to bring up, but Ty Montgomery to a 2-year, $3.6 million deal, $300,000 guaranteed. It's not an amazing deal, but like they gave him an average of $1.8 million a year. Ty Montgomery hasn't been relevant for a while. You see what happened with Cordero Patterson, Atlanta, and all that. To me, that is not much different than the 2-year deal they gave James White, and even not much different in terms of guaranteed money. To me, that was an indication that they want somebody to still be in the James White role. Last year when White got hurt, they used Brandon Bolden. I kept wanting Ramondre Stevenson to get those third down snaps, and he wasn't getting them. So bringing in Montgomery to me is just insurance. They can cut him loose. They don't lose a ton of money, but it's insurance that they want somebody to play that third back role that has always been the James White role, which is why I'm projecting so many targets for White. It's sort of a White or I guess Montgomery hybrid, but for my projections, I went a lot lower on Stevenson's targets. And I think they view him, unfortunately, as not as big of a passing weapon based on last year and based on those offseason moves. But I may be reading in that a little too much. With Stevenson, I'm worried he squeezed on both sides, basically. He's kind of Damian Harris's backup or understudy 1B maybe, but also maybe doesn't have as much path to the targets as his profile suggests he should have.
No, that makes sense. It's kind of like saying, okay, I'm conservative on James White because I'm worried about the injury. I shouldn't be, but instead of sliding those few extra target docks from White to Ramondre, I should be sending them to receiving back X, which, maybe is Ty Montgomery. White's interesting to talk through. Like, part of me wants to still draft him real late in managed PPR leagues where I can just cut him if he gets cut or if he starts the year on PUP. If for some reason he doesn't, he does feel like, especially for zero RB teams, kind of free value. Because I think if he's healthy and on the active roster, as you said, Brandon Bolden was getting double-digit target shares last year. James White, I think, could waltz into 6 catches a game, which is going to be highly valuable in PPR. You can draft it for completely free. I don't have the same take in best ball because I don't think you want to risk that he's on PUP. You can't drop him, the first round of waivers because there are no waivers. What are your thoughts on White?
I completely agree. I think it's been weird. In basically every draft I've done this year, I get towards the end and I'm like, James White looks like the most appealing running back out of everyone who's left. Where he's going, I mean, I feel like I can lock him up for 50 catches almost. I have him projected for 49. He's a really interesting early value. The health thing is a very big concern, but especially when you talk about like managed leagues, if you're already drafting those, why wouldn't you take a shot on James White late? He could be a week 1 starter for you if you're doing like a 0 RB team.
Going over to wide receiver, Jacoby Myers, we have a big difference on. I have him at 93 targets. You have him at 122. Jacoby Myers was a big win for, targets per out run last year. This might be another case where, it's possible we're, at least on the base projection for Jacoby Myers, we're being a little bit conservative. Just wondering what the upside is there. And also just understanding that we're like pretty ahead of market, but you also want to stay kind of pure and just give the best projection that you think you possibly can. So we might be light on Jacoby Myers. And what's undoubtable though, is he does have this ceiling from a target share standpoint to earn like a mid 25% target share, which is like a really valuable talent to have. That's what he did last year. What did he catch? He catch 83 balls last year.
83 balls, 126 targets. So I'm basically projecting him right at the same target rate. I think I have him, what did you say, 122? So I'm 4 targets lighter than where he was at last year.
Yeah. My concern, where I'm probably a little bit different, is they do draft Tyquan Thornton in the 2nd round. They bring in Devontae Parker, and they don't lose a whole lot. Nelson Aguilar still there. Kendrick Bourne, who was productive in the playoff game down the stretch, still there. So I think just likely, it's possible we're being too conservative, but that's the dynamic at play here. Like, do these targets come from Jacoby Myers or not?
So the way I'm viewing this is I actually am higher on Bourne as well. And I think Bourne kind of maintains his role as that third receiver. And I think Myers kind of maintains his slot role. And then I'm looking at it like Parker, Aguilar, and Thornton are in some ways competing for the same snaps on the other outside spot. It might be that Parker goes and takes it, and he seems like obviously the most likely answer to that, but he might not fit as quickly. We've seen some vets come into New England and not fit as quickly. Maybe Thornton plays a little more Maybe Aguilar's in there. I have Aguilar getting squeezed out quite a bit behind Parker and Thornton. But I'm seeing those three. I mean, I think the way that Bourne played, I think his role probably sticks. And there's not really a slot competition in that group unless you're going to put like just Tyquan Speed in the slot. I mean, how are you thinking through like the actual wide receiver positions as it relates to these guys?
Yeah, I'm honestly not too sure. That's not exactly my forte. I'm kind of just looking at the overall playing time they had last year, the new guys they brought in, how that might get distributed. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see from a personnel standpoint. Maybe Jacoby's not as much risk as I think he is. Regardless, it seems like the market is baking in the risk even more than I am. Either that or they really think there's no upside here because he's going off, in the wide receiver 60s. And even with a huge pullback in targets, that we're projecting, we have him as, a wide receiver in the 50s range, basically. And I wonder if the market is overly critical of the lack of touchdowns, which can just be really fluky, especially when it's as low as someone Jacoby Myers has been. I think he had 2 last year, very memorably, had 1 called back. That was going to be his first touchdown. I think he set the record by a decent margin for most targets or catches to start a career or even just any stretch without a touchdown. But that stuff can be real fluky, Ben. And there's very little room to drop off when you're at 2. It can kind of only go one direction.
Right. I mean, I'm not projecting him to have a huge TD rate, but I've got him at just over 4 touchdowns. Yeah, I'm with you. And he scored in the preseason, I remember, which was funny because he had not scored yet in the regular season. He had the 1 called back, like you said. He ends up with 2. He had no receiving TDs his first 2 years. 2 through 3 years is not sustainable, obviously. And with the amount of work he's got, he's actually gotten quite a few targets. I would expect that he has the possibility to catch 6 or more, but I'm projecting him for a very low TD rate.
Hunter Henry, we've got very similar lines on, which puts him basically break-even play at ADP. So don't want to spend too much time on him. I do think it's interesting. You still have Jonnu Smith at Henry's heels a little bit. I have him lower, like 39 targets. You have him at 56, which I'm interested to hear because there were times last year in DFS where I was like, I don't know, I kind of want to play Jonnu at 2,600. I don't know if he's completely dead. And if you're playing in the FFPC best ball leagues in particular, I mean, you're getting real deep at tight end. Jonnu is getting drafted in your league. So it is somewhat interesting. You basically, do you take Jonnu Smith ahead of like Mo Alley Cox, CJ Uzama, or do you take him like behind, Trey McBride and some of those guys? So how do you feel about Jonnu?
I mean, he was really, really good on a per route run basis last year, which I'm not. I mean, number one, that's largely because they're designing some plays for him. But he's an explosive player. Tennessee used to use him on some run plays. They paid him a big contract. Josh McDaniels leaves. The offense might get shook up a little bit. Maybe there was something there where it was, more McDaniels who didn't want to feature Jonnu as much. I'm just looking at it like when he actually ran some routes, he was pretty good. And I think it's sort of hard to imagine with the contract he got that he could do anything less than he did last year. He's really, really cheap, like you said. And in like tight end premium formats, I think he's a really easy guy to take at the very end of drafts because, I mean, we were taking him in the middle rounds last year for a reason because of the contract, because of what he had done in Tennessee. I think he's actually a good player. He was good last year when he got opportunity. He just didn't run routes. Like, how much do you think that's going to stick? It might stick, but again, the offensive coordinator's gone. Maybe there's enough of a shakeup in the way that they view their offense that he actually does get to run a few more routes. Is sort of the way I'm looking at it.
Yeah. And a reminder on uncertainty. I think last year for a good stretch, Jonnu Smith was going in round 13 and Hunter Henry was going around 18, so maybe again, we're wrong. We could be wrong again this year. We obviously have more of a concrete sample of this exact situation, but things change and we can be overconfident in the pecking order. Going over to the Jets, man, this is another tough team to project, in large part because we just have no idea if Zach Wilson's good or if he's not. Just how bad is he? Is he really bad or just a little bit bad? Because they added a ton of talent to this offense. From a play calling standpoint, we are really close. Have the Jets around basically 62 plays per game, calling a pass play around 62% of the time, which is leading to roughly 34 pass attempts, 25 rush attempts. I recently brought the pass rate down, did look at some stuff. This, like, the concern for me is, despite all the talent, are they afraid to let Zach Wilson loose? If you look at the pass rate over expectation, week 7 through 11, Wilson got hurt or left early that week 7 week. They had a plus 4.5% pass rate over expectation. They had a lot of those short passes with Mike White. They were running at a faster pace with Mike White. And then if you look at all the other weeks, it's a slower pace. Yeah. Slower pace the other weeks, and a minus 1.3% pass rate over expectation on average the other week. So, man, it's tough for me because I see a lot of upside from the individuals here, but it could all be ruined if Zach Wilson is bad or if they just simply don't trust him, and that bleeds through to the play calling.
Yeah, I always think it's super funny when we end up this close on the team level stuff, because I'm like scratching my head, like I don't know what to do. But yeah, I gave them a few more plays, made them more run heavy, just like you said, and we wound up pretty close. And the run heavy was, I noted, because of those White and Flacco games where they were a lot pass heavier. They had Breece Hall, that's kind of a tip of the hand a little bit that obviously they had Garrett Wilson as well, but they're going to, think about running, and they have some of the, Shanahan coaching tree in place as well, much like we just talked about with Miami. I think they're going to run some, but you said it really well. I mean, they have a lot of talent. Elijah Moore looks like a legit NFL player, and then they go take a wide receiver 10th overall, who no one wants to draft, by the way. I don't know what is going on with Garrett Wilson's ADP. But I mean, even Corey Davis is it's a fine number 3. I've always been kind of hard on him, but this is a team that, if Zach Wilson's good, could be really good, frankly. And I mean, you put it well. It comes down to whether or not he can play and whether or not they trust him with the play calling.
Yeah, and we do have to. This is where I think people sometimes are overly simplistic, and they're like, clearly Zach Wilson sucks. But we don't know that for sure, right? I mean, we have to account for the ranges of outcomes here, and at the ADPs that these players have, these skill players, there's just, a lot of that risk is baked in, and very little of that upside is baked in. I think that starts at Breece Hall, who just got in that draft that I did last night with Silva. We got him in the 5th round as our RB1, middle of the 5th round. That felt like a pretty good price tag on Breece Hall, type of player you want to target in that zone if you are going to draft a running back, because it's probably going to be fine to start the year and then has the ability to really be a league winner down the stretch if he's as talented as we think he is and he overtakes that role. First running back drafted in the NFL draft. We have him and Michael Carter we have Breece Hall for 207 rush attempts, Michael Carter for 112 rush attempts. We're in lockstep there.
I mean, it is. This is even closer than whatever other team you mentioned that we were super close on, but our Breece
New England.
Identical.
The only thing we're off a little bit is I'm more optimistic on the targets for Breece Hall. Have him at 46.3. Basically have him and Michael Carter splitting targets down the middle. You have a bit more targets on the periphery. Usually it's the opposite, but you've got a bit more for Ty Johnson, Tevin Coleman. Not a lot, just a few more, and those all seem to be coming from Breece Hall. So what do you see as the passing game upside for Hall?
Well, I also have the running back target rate coming down a decent amount. And I have a note that it had a lot to do with White and Flacco. They threw the running backs a ton in those games. As anyone who was playing, DFS will remember. We had the Mike White, Ty Johnson and Michael Carter were both catching 8 passes for a couple of games there in that Mike White stretch. But I think that's really interesting, because I wound up with a Breece Hall projection that I was like, I'm not going to base a draft decision on this projection.
Right.
It's very similar to the thing we talked about at the top of the show, where I think he can beat this by 50%. The receiving is a great example. I'm excited to see where you guys are at on his receiving. The way that I thought through it was, look, Michael Carter in college profiled as a really good receiving back. He played with Javonte Williams at UNC. He basically played on the receiving downs. A big reason that Javonte Williams didn't have a lot of receiving in his profile coming out of college. And it makes sense after they go get Hall that they might think of Hall as more of the, grinder and Carter as more of the receiver. And so I sort of projected as such, but I don't have any confidence in that. And then you mentioned Ty Johnson, I still have getting a few more targets than you guys do, and guys like that, where Maybe Hall as a rookie won't get trusted as much on the passing downs, and we both have him as a 200 carry back, which is nice to see. I definitely think he has the upside to hit the target number that you guys put in there.
Yeah, I think it's possible too, taking a second look at our target shares, that if these guys are healthy, that basically if they get to a high teens target share for the running back position as a whole, which isn't that high, that they can both see a decent amount of targets. Michael Carter just taking basically all the obvious pass game targets, and then Breece Hall just in the natural course of the offense.
Yeah.
There are 2 down backs out there. I mean, I think of Antonio Gibson, for Breece Hall and JD McKissick, right? Like that team targets the running back more than the Jets are going to, but like they both get theirs. Their combined target shares can be way higher than Breece's and Carter's, but Carter can be the JD McKissick role. Breece Hall can be the Gibson role, where Gibson was still getting a 10% target share, even as the 2 down back.
Or Jonathan Taylor and Hines. I'm probably light on my running back target share. I probably overcooked the White Flacco stuff and being concerned about that. I have the wide receiver target shares very high on this team, and then also have tight ends pretty low, because this isn't a team. And typically I think of the combined running back and tight end target shares as being higher than what I have, because they're obviously both going to be in shorter areas. This is not a team that has probably huge tight end target numbers, and so that probably helps sort of your thought process there, that somebody like Breece Hall could have a lot more targets than I have in my projection.
So we'll go to the receivers, and one note on Wilson, because we glossed over him a little bit fast because we're close on him, but he is actually a target for me in these best ball drafts at the end, because again, uncertainty. If he's good, he actually has some legitimate upside because of all the talent around him. And I do think there's a chance he uses his legs a little bit more than last year. I said last year, I think there's a chance he uses his legs a little bit more than he did in college. So take that with a grain of salt, of course. But you're beating the drum for Garrett Wilson and Elijah Moore. I feel like the Elijah Moore swing has been crazy. Pre-draft, I thought people were nuts. He was like top 15 wide receiver. I was like, this is too rich. Then he drops, I think, too many spots when Garrett Wilson gets drafted. Trying to check now, Elijah Moore is down to wide receiver 32 on Underdog, which we have him ranked around there, but I think there's some, as far as tiebreakers go, some of the tiebreakers with other receivers in that range, for me, go to Elijah Moore, who was a prospect we liked a lot. We had him on our NFC team. We were so excited to play him down the stretch because it looked like he had broken out, and then unfortunately he was hurt. And people tend to, I think, get too concerned with target share competition. Like, it's a big deal, especially from a base projection standpoint. But sometimes offenses, like, there's 3 guys that they're going to throw to. And when it's a 3-headed monster, I think it gets overblown because there's enough target volume for Elijah Moore, Garrett Wilson, Corey Davis to coexist. And then you have to factor in, I mean, there's, what'd you say, 20, 25% chance one of the other 2 wide receivers in any trio gets hurt, misses time just because of injury rates in the NFL. Now, all of a sudden, that target share crunch that we were so worried about is the exact opposite. It's a boon for the 2 guys that are left over. So I'm pretty into the Jets offense overall.
Yeah. This is a team that definitely has upside. I agree with everything you're saying on Moore. I mean, he was really good in year 1. Talk about like targets per out run and those types of things. One of the reasons I wasn't as high on the running back target rate is I have Elijah Moore's ADOT kind of coming down, filling some of the Jamison Crowder stuff, and then Garrett Wilson into some of the more downfield stuff for Elijah Moore. But as part of that, I'm kind of seeing more sort of stealing some of the running back target work and some of this tight end stuff. I was talking about the shorter area work, which would be really good for his target share, his overall profile. Very much into Elijah Moore. At the same time, I don't really understand the gap between him. You're kind of saying he maybe fell too far. The gap between him and Garrett Wilson is weird because Garrett Wilson, 10th overall pick, a prospect that everyone liked. If we are not too concerned about this situation for Elijah Moore, like the only way I can understand why Garrett Wilson's going behind Sky Moore, who I love, and well behind him. He's like in the Chris Olave range. Pre-draft in Dynasty circles, it was Wilson, Burks, London. He's going well behind Burks, and Burks has been getting some bad buzz in OTAs. I like Burks too, but the only thing I can put my finger on with Wilson is that people don't like the landing spot, which is typically the wrong way to think about things with receivers, but even more confusing in relation to people being comfortable with this situation for Elijah Moore. So why can you explain to me why Garrett Wilson's going in like the 10th round?
Yeah, I don't know. We have these guys like basically we have Moore and Wilson both slightly ahead of ADP. So we also have the gap. I guess for me, I feel like Elijah Moore, I get just to repeat, was a good prospect who had the rookie year, essentially kind of what like we wanted. And I'm excited about him. And I feel like there's, I don't know, just a little bit more downside to Garrett Wilson, where I just feel more confident in Elijah Moore's targets because of basically more to rely on.
But what if Garrett Wilson is a superstar? I mean, he's a top 10 pick. I mean, his profile isn't what Jamar Chase's was, but his targets per route run in college rose every year while Olave's was dropping off. Wilson was becoming more of the focal point, and Jackson Smith and Jigba, who's still at Ohio State. They had these just, amazing receivers that forced Jameson Williams to transfer. But Wilson continued to grow and kind of push Olave into more of a secondary receiver role when you look at things like targets per out run. Olave was a year older. I mean, there's this possibility. I agree with you. There's this concern. We haven't seen him do it yet, and we have seen Elijah Moore do it. There's also upside to that for Garrett Wilson, right?
Yeah. I guess what concerns me is like if you compare him to someone like a Drake London or a Treylon Burks, the competition isn't other like a young ascending player like it, whereas so I don't see Elijah Moore stuff going away. And then to even put, a high teens target share, even on the 10th pick is that's about in line with historical expectations. So we have basically Elijah Moore with a 21.5% target share, Garrett Wilson, 18.5%, Corey Davis, 16%. That's where we have it. Braxton Berrios is also just annoying enough and seems like he's going to play a little bit. I'm not too concerned about Berrios because I literally just said, like, I think it's a three-headed monster and that's very good for all three. But I don't know, that's just part of the reason how I get to the gap. But maybe I should just be more bullish on Garrett Wilson because I don't have a great response to you other than that's sort of how it fit when I was running stuff.
Yeah, I don't have a great answer either. Our projections aren't like super different on these players. I have I'm 2 targets lower on Elijah Moore and 4 targets higher on Garrett Wilson or whatever. I mean, I'm very, very close to the gap.
But it does go to the point though about how, again, maybe like the false precision of projections.
Yeah.
Like switching those 5 targets can move a guy a few spots in rankings to the point where he's, goes from break even to a target for you in drafts, which seems ridiculous. But when you're thinking of terms of strength of bet, it's not necessarily that you like him just because he has 4 more targets than you previously thought. It's more like, the strength of the bet, right. The range of outcomes changes based off that.
And he's more like the guy that I think could beat his projection by 50% because we thought he was potentially the wide receiver 1 in this class as a community. A lot of people did in the pre-draft process. He goes 10th overall. I'm just having a hard time. I mean, it seems all landing spot dependent. But if we're comfortable with Elijah Moore, and I am comfortable with Elijah Moore, I kind of just want to bet on the Jets to take a step forward. And if Zach Wilson sucks, then it's going to be sad.
Yeah. Well, I'm bumping up Garrett Wilson a percentage point in target share as we speak. So if he stinks and you use the ETR ranks, blame Ben, not me. And if he's good, I'm the one who made the change. So then you can give me all the credit. Corey Davis, though, I understand he's like typically not the type of guy to be targeted, but he is so free, Ben, that I mean, he's like going in, he's wide receiver 72 on Underdog and former top prospect who's still in his peak wide receiver years. Like he's not old yet. And he's been fairly decent the last couple of seasons. He was really good with Tennessee a couple of years ago, obviously playing with AJ Brown, that type of offense is going to lead to more efficiency, but he was fine last year in the time that he played when he was healthy. So, God, I feel like why not take a stab at Corey Davis late?
I've been tough on him over the last couple of years, and I'm all in on his price. Like I'm usually not taking receivers at that point, but I would not judge anyone drafting Corey Davis where he's going right now. He's going to be in. He's still got the contract. He's going to be in on 3 wide sets. He might and probably will, I think, with 2 young guys play on 2 wide receiver sets. I mean, there's an outside chance he leads the team in targets. I don't think that's going to happen, but like he's a part of this offense. If you think about this as sort of a Bengals light team, right? Where Zach Wilson isn't probably Joe Burrow. Garrett Wilson's probably not Jamar Chase coming in with a good second-year receiver in Elijah Moore, who maybe is more than what T. Higgins was going into last year, but it's a lot like the Bengals going into last year. Corey Davis is sort of the Tyler Boyd, but even cheaper. You still have that contingency-based upside that you talked about where, if one of the young guys misses some time, Corey Davis is pretty clearly going to step into more work. Maybe Braxton Berrios is a little bit of a thorn at that point because they do have a decent fourth receiver that would probably step into some as well. But I don't get it with Corey Davis. If you're the type that's inclined to take receivers in those later rounds, you're not doing a lot of 0 RB drafts, which I do. Corey Davis at cost is a pretty easy bet.
Yeah, and then particularly in best ball, I mean, he's going to provide you with the type of weeks, honestly, that is really fine in best ball. As if you're drafting 8-9 wide receivers, getting a guy that's just going to give you a handful of double-digit weeks is fine. Like, you don't necessarily need the absurd ceiling outcome to be taking a player there. Tight end, I have to dig into this a little bit more because there was a report that Conklin might be having a leg up over CJ Uzama for the tight end 1 role. We have CJ Uzama currently as kind of the lead for targets here at tight end. It's not a very fantasy friendly position. It's in redraft managed. You're not taking either of these guys. I don't think you're sniffing them, but in best ball, you may draft one or the other. So, anything else to add there, Ben?
No.
Yeah, I didn't think so. It's not very exciting, but it is, somewhat important to try and get the pecking order down.
Yeah,
so we'll continue
I'm projecting
the
him
there.
Yeah, I'm projecting him super even. I think it's tough to see this offense be the one that has a breakout tight end with how good the receivers are. I mean, that's the way that I put it. And they have good running backs. So
yeah,
it's not a spot where you're like, oh yeah. And you think about like Logan Thomas from 2 years ago for Washington kind of came out of nowhere because Washington didn't have a lot of other guys. This is not a team where there's no one else.
Absolutely. All right. Episode 1 out of 8 in the books for the off-season projection special with Ben Gretch. Again, you can find Ben Gretch at bengretch.substack.com. You can listen to his podcast with Sean Siegel, Stealing Bananas, on iTunes. Also catch him Wednesday nights on Ship Chasing with our buddies Pat Crane and Peter Overset. You can catch all my work over at Establish the Run. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Helps us to do content like this for free. And if you are into the audio version, you can find that at Establish the Edge on iTunes. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll be back with some more projections work on some other divisions later in the week.